Today we are going to look at props as well as dress and how we should dress and the influence of color on the perception of our audience. This is important.
Mind manipulation!
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where we examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a video from Pastor Benjamin Fagan. Now, for those not familiar with Ben or his content, he's a pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a Protestant denomination descended from the mid-19th century Millerite movement and established in 1863. The SDAs are primarily distinguished by their observance of Saturday as opposed to Sunday as the official Sabbath, their belief in the imminent second coming or advent of Christ, and in a somewhat controversial annihilationist soteriology, which is the belief that after the Last Judgment, all damned human souls and fallen angels, including the big bad devil himself, will be completely destroyed, as opposed to the more mainstream Christianity accepted variants of eternal conscious torment for the unsaved. Now, in this video, the first in a series of 3 by the way, Ben claims that he has identified 4 tests for truth that he thinks atheism cannot pass.
Wait, what?
Now, upon hearing that, I know you're probably thinking that there really is only one test of truth that atheism would have to pass, and that's if the individual who's claiming to be an atheist does not in fact believe in the existence of a god or gods, given that it's a position, that's only concerned with that one proposition. So it appears at first glance that Ben here might be making the grand mistake of assuming that simply being an atheist logically entails that the individual holds to some very specific scientific and philosophical positions, which basically means he's pretty much given away the game with the title alone. But since here at Bridge the Divide we are all about that comprehensive breakdown, let's take a moment to hear what wisdom Ben has to impart to us from all the way up in the Great White North.
Imagine living in a world without ultimate meaning, where morality is just a social construct and the origin of everything you see is left to chance.
So if I'm following you here, Ben, you pretty much want us to imagine what it would be like to live in a completely naturalistic universe. One in which the ultimate meaning for one's life is freely determined by the individual as opposed to having it dictated to them, in which moral valuations are subjectively determined by individuals and the onus for finding commonality between them is entirely on people, and in which human existence is a product of natural, unguided forces, thus relegating humans with the full responsibility of being the arbiters of their own fates. Well, seeing as how this particular model is logically possible, evidence-backed, and deeply empowering at a personal level, it's not something really all that hard to imagine. In fact, I'd argue that it's the most rational one to work with until we can find any actual evidence that indicates that any one of those conclusions are false.
It sounds bleak, right?
No, to me it actually sounds pretty damn good. But it does look pretty bad that you've kicked this entire thing off with nothing more than an emotional appeal. I don't know, Ben, maybe you just don't like the idea of being saddled with the full responsibility for your own existence, and would much prefer some other authoritative figure be in charge to make all those heavier adult decisions for you.
But what if I told you that atheism, which is the belief that there is no God, fails 4 essential tests of truth?
So this is a very weird statement, mostly because it doesn't really jive with how we humans establish what truth is regarding the world around us. Now obviously, our species on a daily basis utilizes a methodology by which we can independently confirm whether any given proposition is probabilistically true. And generally we conclude that that methodology is sufficient enough to at minimum pass the smell test as far as truth is concerned. But I get the feeling, Ben, that what you're actually driving at is humans determining absolute truth, or that which we would call necessarily true because the contrary would be impossible. And this is problematic for 2 reasons. First, it implies that you're starting from the assumption that certain metaphysical positions are true, which of course would be positions that you would have to defend as being true without begging the question. And second, you would have to establish and independently confirm the methodology by which you were able to cross the gap from your internal subjective experience of reality to making statements about what we presume to be the objective reality that we are all interfacing with. Now at this point, Ben, something that would be really helpful is for us to understand what exactly is your personal philosophy of truth, because by knowing that we would be able to better understand the foundation from which you are critiquing atheism, which by the way is a position that is making a statement about the individual, not external reality.
In this video, we're going to uncover those 4 tests and show how atheism collapses under scrutiny and reveal a worldview that truly satisfies both heart and mind. Stick around to the end to discover the truth that offers real hope and meaning.
Well, first, the only way that atheism would ever collapse is if you were to actually demonstrate that a God exists. Second, your personal satisfaction with such a concept is not evidence for anything. And third, that which constitutes real hope and meaning for you is entirely subjective. Unless, of course, you're able to demonstrate the existence of a mind-independent source for objective hope and meaning in the universe.
When evaluating any worldview, including atheism,
He did it again!
Well, Benjamin, that is a pretty big red flag, because it indicates that you likely have very little understanding of the thing that you're about to critique. Atheism itself does not constitute the totality of a worldview, and that's because, as I stated previously, atheism itself does not logically entail holding to any other specific scientific or philosophical positions. I think it goes without saying that if you were to start from a foundation of malformed understanding, then your conclusions will be equally, if not more, malformed.
it must pass 4 critical apologetics tests.
It's actually impressive just how front-loaded that statement was. Utterly ridiculous, but still impressive. However, I do appreciate your willingness to establish openly that you think that you have access to absolute truth. Now let's see you demonstrate it.
The first is correspondence. Second, consistency. Next, comprehensiveness. And then practical application.
Okay, so let's break down your 4 tests for truth that you think atheism can't pass. Correspondence is pretty simple. It's understood that most people on the planet adhere to correspondence theory of truth, that which is true is that which corresponds with reality. But because we also know that concluding correspondence is greatly affected by one's understanding of what they are observing, a correlation that often results in cognitive biases such as false positives and false negatives, we know that correspondence theory can only get you to a probabilistic determination of truth. And the best way to increase that probability is through independent testing and confirmation. Consistency is interesting because that could go one of 2 ways. It can either go to logical consistency or to the efficacy of predictive modeling. Logical consistency is good because if your conclusion is determined to be a result of fallacious reasoning, then you would not have justification to claim that it was true. And predictive modeling is good because if the outcome of an analysis, experiment, or calculation is reliably consistent, especially in independent testing, then we can establish that our interpretation of the starting data is correct and that the proposition that we are testing is probabilistically true. It's also important to note that a determination of consistency can also be greatly affected by one's cognitive biases, which of course puts more emphasis on the independent testing part of the methodology. I will say, Ben, it would have been nice if you would establish which one of these you're referring to here. Comprehensiveness is pretty important because that goes to the strength of any given explanation elicited by its thoroughness. The problem is I'm not really sure how comprehensiveness applies to either atheism or even the God concept itself, given that no theist has ever provided a comprehensive mechanistic explanation as to how their God does anything beyond appealing to magic and mystery, which of course relegates their claim that their God is doing anything to a baseless assertion that begs the question. It's also important to remember that any potential or lack of personal satisfaction that could be derived from any given assertion or explanation has zero bearing on its truth or falsity. Just because it makes you feel good doesn't make it true, and just because it makes you feel bad doesn't make it false. But the worst of these purported tests would of course be practical application. Practical application refers to applying what one has learned into actual situations. The problem here is that any ultimate determinations that are derived from the practical applicability of one's beliefs will be deeply informed by the set of what one has not learned, what they have learned, and the manner in which they have learned it. If you are conditioned to believe that expressing your personal beliefs in public to others will result in being rejected by most people, and you are conditioned to believe that you are being rejected for a specific reason that's not being directly expressed by the people who are rejecting you, then your practical application will of course result in your expectations being confirmed. But that of course assumes that the reason for your rejection that is given to you by those who taught you is true, which means if you are being rejected for another logically viable reason, like your lack of logical consistency, then your practical application would have no bearing on truth as it would only serve your confirmation bias. Needless to say, expected results are not a good benchmark for what is true. One would still require a mechanism by which they could eliminate any potential cognitive biases that they're bringing in. The potential failures of practical application are by far one of the greatest reasons why we have the independent peer review process. So to sum up for you, Benjamin, your tests for truth here need to be able to account for independent testing, and none of your tests demonstrate demonstrate how your personal God concept allows you to jump the gap from your personal subjective experience to what we would call objective external reality. But I surmise that you already know that, and that is why you are deliberately not mentioning the one vital piece that we all know exists in your worldview puzzle.
These tests reveal whether a worldview aligns with reality, avoids contradictions, and explains life's big questions, and works in daily life.
So you were talking about logical consistency there.
But does atheism pass these tests? Let's find out.
So here's the problem, Benjamin. The answer to this question is neither yes or no, because your tests here don't actually apply to atheism itself. Specifically, your tests apply to one's personal philosophy of truth and other philosophical positions that they may hold, none of which are logically entailed by simply being an atheist. So you asking this question only serves to demonstrate that you don't actually know what atheism is or what it entails. And as such, you are just trying to get the atheist to provide a rational justification for various philosophical positions that you hold in your theistic worldview without appealing to your God. If only you were willing to put as much energy into understanding opposing positions as you do in ignoring basic information just because it contradicts your worldview. But I get it. Nowhere in the Bible does it state that the believer must be intellectually honest when critiquing those that don't believe what they do.
The correspondence test asks this: does this worldview match the observable world?
And the most parsimonious answer, being the answer that makes the fewest assumptions about the reality that is being observed, would be yes, because no God has yet been demonstrated to exist independently of mind and context, which of course would relegate any assertion of correspondence to nothing more than confirmation bias.
Atheism claims the universe emerged from nothing without a cause.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
How many times are we going to have to correct you people on this? No, that is not what atheism claims. That is not what atheists claim. That is not even what cosmology claims. The only people claiming that something came from nothing are you theists. That your God conjured or actualized everything in the not God set literally out of nothingness by way of God magic. Your profound ignorance of these topics is really beginning to show, Benji.
Yet the observable world shows us that everything with a beginning must have a cause.
I see you're making the same mistake Aquinas did when he derived that the universe had a beginning from his observation that everything around him in the material world apparently had a beginning as well. Unfortunately for him and for you, this is a fallacy of composition. That which is true for parts of the set is not necessarily true for the set itself. Also, the evidence that we have access to, evidence that obviously Aquinas himself did not, indicates that the universe that we currently observe did not in fact have a beginning but is just one state the universe can take. This right here, Benji, is what I was talking about when I mentioned conclusions that are derived when information is missing or willfully rejected from one's knowledge set.
The Bible says in Hebrews chapter...
I'm gonna have to cut you off there, Benjamin, because citing the Bible is completely irrelevant. You citing the Bible as evidence automatically assumes that the God exists for the Bible to be evidence of it, which means you're just begging the question.
How can atheism explain this foundational principle of causality?
1, atheism doesn't posit explanations for that because that's the job of cosmology. 2, you claiming the answer is a God because your particular book said it is just begging the question. Yes, there are questions out there that we currently cannot answer, but that certainly doesn't mean the answer is a God or even your God. And just because ancient people, who by the way were operating with less information about reality than you currently have access to, asserted that it was their God doesn't make it true.
Atheists argue that life exists by chance.
No, we don't argue that either because atheism itself is not concerned with origins of life. That is the job of evolutionary biologists and origin of life researchers, none of whom, by the way, assert that life came about by random chance. Things came about the way they are now because of the prior conditions that facilitated those outcomes. The only difference here is that no one, other than theists themselves, are asserting any kind of grand intentionality behind it. That you don't like that implication is not our problem, and the burden of proof for the claim that there is such grand intentionality would of course be on you, the positive claimant.
But scientists have shown that the universe's constants like gravity, electromagnetism, and others are fine-tuned for life.
So Ben, this is either just you straight up lying, or simply not understanding the failures of the teleological argument. No one, other than theists themselves, are asserting that the universe is fine-tuned specifically for life.
Chance doesn't correspond to such precision.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Isn't design a more logical conclusion?
No, because that assumes the existence of a designer, and until you can demonstrate that such a thing exists, your conclusion will remain fallacious. The most logically consistent and therefore rational explanation, given the evidence that we have access to, is that life itself is an emergent property of organic chemical processes.
If atheism can't explain the origin and order of the universe,
which again is not its job. That's the job taken on by the scientists in those particular fields.
is it really aligned with reality?
Yes, because until such an entity is demonstrated to exist in external reality, then the conclusion is the most parsimonious and logically consistent and therefore the most rational.
I think it's out of this world.
Well, that's to be expected given how fundamentally flawed your foundational understanding of these topics is.
We'll revisit this. Consistency asks, does this worldview contradict itself?
Again, atheism itself does not constitute the totality of a worldview. But to answer the question, no, there is no logical contradiction in the non-theistic or naturalistic worldview being true.
Atheism, or atheists, often say morality is subjective, shaped by evolution or society.
Often, but not always. There are some atheists who hold to moral realism. But yes, for the most part, non-believers do hold that individual moral distinctions are subjectively derived. They're informed by the individual's evolved capacity for empathy, and they are aligned with the subjective frameworks that are imposed within the society to accomplish the society's agreed-upon goals. There's no issue here.
But then, why do atheists also claim things like murder or oppression are basically objectively wrong?
So, Ben, this is your failure to understand the difference between what is meant by describing something as being objective or subjective. Objective truth would be those things that are mind-independently true, meaning that for them to be true, the existence of a mind as a referent is not necessary. Subjective would be those things that are mind-dependently true, meaning that the truth valuation for these things is dependent upon the existence of a mind as a referent. When someone who is a moral relativist makes the determination that things like murder and slavery and other things are objectively wrong, it is only because these things are objectively wrong in virtue of their relationship to the goals established by a society, not that they are wrong in any kind of mind-independent sense. The subjectively agreed upon goals of the society are what are acting as an external referent for the determination of what is true. Just because a society may establish any particular action as being immoral within the framework of that society does not indicate that the distinction of that particular action being immoral is mind-independently true. But this also applies to your God, Ben. Because you define your God as being this ultimate entity for which nothing exists external of itself that must be appealed to in order to make any distinctions, then any distinction that your God happens to make would be necessarily dependent upon its mind, which would of course confirm moral relativism. For further context, Ben, this particular logical conclusion is what is ascertained from the Euthyphro dilemma. And we can go ahead and skip this part because it's just Ben once again appealing to the Bible. We're supposed to be talking about truth here, Ben, but so far you only seem concerned with demonstrating how broken your epistemology is.
Atheists argue that a good God would not allow evil. Yet in rejecting God, they're left with no standard for calling anything evil. How can atheism condemn what it claims doesn't objectively exist?
We defend it by appealing to our own survival and how that survival is facilitated by what we agree upon in society. That you may personally feel that's insufficient is both irrelevant and not our problem.
Comprehensiveness asks this question: can this worldview explain the big questions of life?
Again, atheism is only concerned with one proposition, so any questions beyond the scope of that one proposition are not the concern of atheism. Depending on the questions that you're asking, we could of course look to the fields of study that are concerned with answering those questions.
Atheism argues life arose through chemical evolution.
Wrong again, Benji. That is a hypothesis presented by origin of life researchers, and it is a hypothesis that is based upon the mountains of evidence that we have access to.
But life's complexity, especially DNA's coded information, defies naturalistic explanations.
It actually doesn't. The repetition of alleles through the act of reproduction within the numbers of a population in response to natural selection pressures resulting in both morphological and phylogenetic changes, which is the phenomenon that we call evolution, is a demonstrated fact whether you like it or not. And we're going to go ahead and skip this section because it's just Ben ignorantly misrepresenting organic chemistry, and again citing the Bible as if it backs his wild claims about the nature of life.
Is atheism's answer to life's origin sufficient?
Well, atheism doesn't provide one because it is not concerned with that proposition. But the potential answers provided by the methodology and origin of life research is. You just don't happen to like it because it doesn't confirm what you personally feel and think other people should personally feel about life.
Without God, atheism offers no ultimate purpose.
Yeah, it's much more empowering to let people know that their ultimate purpose is for them alone to decide, as opposed to having it dictated to them in complete disregard of their agency.
Are we just cosmic accidents?
There's that intellectually dishonest language. No, life is not an accident because an agent labeling a particular outcome as an accident implies that the outcome, while logically possible, was not the outcome that the agent originally intended to have happen. So you, Benji, labeling life as being either intended or accidental is not only a false dichotomy, but it is also you still assuming that there is an agent involved in the process. We conclude from the evidence that we have access to that life as we currently understand it on this planet is a result of the prior conditions that facilitated its existence. More irrelevant Bible nonsense.
Atheism leaves life's deepest question unanswered.
Well, again, it's not the job of atheism to answer that, and you're also assuming that just because these questions happen to be important to you, that they are equally important to every other person on the planet. And while I can't speak for every person on the planet, I can tell you that for me personally, questions that can't currently be answered may make for fun thought experimentation, but they're not something that really eats up a lot of my interest.
If atheism leaves life's big questions unanswered, what does that mean for its validity?
Seeing as how the running theme of this video is pointing out how it's not atheism's job to answer any of this stuff, the only thing that speaks to the validity of someone not believing in the existence of a god or gods is if their disbelief is rationally justified. Which, by the way, it is.
So stay tuned for the practical test. Here it comes. The practice test asks this question. Can this worldview work in real life?
Yes, it does, and we know this because we see it on the daily in countries that are staunchly secular, whose populations are predominantly non-believing because religious leanings are in sharp decline there. The evidence for this is readily available to you, Benji, unless, of course, like I mentioned earlier, that evidence is contained within the set of information that you willfully reject simply because it contradicts your worldview.
Atheism, it offers no hope beyond the grave.
Seriously, Ben, the amount of weight that you think atheism itself is holding up is astonishingly stupid. Hope can be derived from many things. Just because one doesn't believe in the existence of an afterlife doesn't mean that individual cannot hope for anything. Hope for their individual futures, for that of their families, for that of our species, for that of the collective planet are examples of this. You can hope that a particular outcome that you desire will be true even though you won't be around to see it. It would just put the emphasis on you to dedicate your life to accomplishing that goal as much as you could before you die. Acknowledging that the current evidence indicates that death is the end of experience is not problematic unless you decide to make it so. This whole projection of your ignorant assumptions about atheism onto atheists is both pathetic and obvious. Even more irrelevant Bible nonsense.
What happens when we compare atheism's failures with a worldview that passes all four tests?
Well, the answer is simple, Ben. You're just not gonna like it.
Here it comes.
The non-theistic worldview wins out in this one as the most rational.
How?
It corresponds with reality in the most parsimonious way. It is logically consistent because there is no logical contradiction posed by it. It's the most comprehensive because it relies entirely upon independently confirmed evidence-backed explanatory and predictive modeling, and doesn't make assumptions about things existing that can't be demonstrated to exist. And it's the most practical in application because it works to eliminate the unnecessary us versus them mentalities that are generated by religious application, and it utilizes actual evidence that applies equally to everyone to empower the individual within the society, instead of the assumption-backed top-down thinking that enslaves the individual to the ideology. But most importantly, unlike the theistic worldview, it isn't predicated upon the assumption that a God entity exists. Because your worldview at its core begs the question of the existence of such an entity, anything you derive as being true from that initial assumption is immediately tainted, and it will remain that way until you are able to demonstrate that your God entity actually exists. So as far as these tests of yours go, atheism itself is not a position position that is concerned with answering any of these questions, and you shot your own worldview in the foot the moment you pulled out your big book of wholly unsubstantiated claims and started citing it as though it were true. And we can go ahead and skip this last section because it's just Ben making more emotional appeals, and again citing from the Bible as though it means anything. Though I do find it interesting that he really goes out of his way to make a big point of the fact that he's a Seventh-day Adventist, which means I would ask, by what mechanism are you able to determine that your particular interpretation of the Christian faith is the correct one out of all of them? Do you alone on the planet have a solution to the problem of hermeneutics, Benji?
I'm gonna say no.
Or are you just going to appeal to that one piece in your worldview puzzle that you conveniently never got around to addressing? That piece specifically being faith as a necessary component. But as I alluded to earlier, I think I know why you chose to never bring it up. Because ultimately, I think you recognize that your entire position is predicated on nothing more than your feelings. And that openly acknowledging that faith is a necessary component of your worldview would ultimately cut the legs out from under your entire critique of atheism. It's just too bad you weren't smart enough to realize that invoking your Bible as evidence would result in the exact same outcome. Now, the best way to bridge the divide here is one that I've spoken about before. Personally, I don't think that people like Ben here spread the misinformation that they do with any kind of malicious intent, which basically leaves the only other option. They spread it out of the sheer ignorance that is the result of their cult indoctrination. It's entirely possible that Ben here simply doesn't have the information necessary in order to make the most basic salient point. Why exactly he doesn't have that information when it's readily available to everyone is of course anyone's guess. But until he catches up with the rest of us, the best tactic to use here is to ensure that the people he's preaching to have the information needed to recognize his misinformation for what it is. One thing I've seen that continuously works to maintain the divide between believers and non-believers is a persistent sense of imbalance between the two groups that reinforces senses of either being superior or being at a disadvantage. And it's with the spreading of that information that has either been kept from or is just out of reach of the believers that we can, at minimum, level the playing field. Because when we can more often approach these sometimes contentious topics from equal footing, then we can begin to see some real progress, not just within our personal interactions, but within our societies as well. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, March is Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support this channel further, links to channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear are also in the description. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every single one of you for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.